Hello, hello. Alright, I want to talk about my most recent reading. I'm very excited. Um, that is Minima Moralia from Theodor Adorno. I cannot explain how cathartic this reading has been. In this book, it's all written in aphorisms, so separate sections. It reminds me a little bit of like the Nietzschean style, especially with Zarathustra. I used to have Zarathustra next to my bed all the time. I actually don't think I've ever read cover to cover Zarathustra, but what I did is I probably read the book 5 times just by opening different passages, reading one passage several times, reading the one after, the one before, and writing and like connecting them. This is very similar, but this is way more philosophical, less allegorical, less poetic, and more incisive. It's a critique and a diagnosis of society. In that sense, it reminds me of the other texts like the Civilization and its Contents from Freud, or it reminds me as well to the genealogy of morals from Nietzsche, in the sense that it's also trying to diagnose something that is wrong with society. The difference is that this book is like, it doesn't leave anything out. So it's mainly attacking bourgeois liberalism or capitalism, if you want to say it that way, and it's sort of like explaining why bourgeois morality and bourgeois economics are not compatible, because the belief of this is sort of like one of the main arguments, but this, as I'm telling you, like each aphorism here, each section is like you could make a a PhD research with each section. So basically the capitalism is sort of built upon the idea that there is some certain kind of respect for the individual. Adorno is arguing that contrary to the belief that capitalism or liberal bourgeois liberalism is the society of freedom, is just actually another society of unfreedom. People who defend bourgeois liberalism tends to compare it as opposed to, for example, totalitarianism, to sort of defend the freedom that is given here. But the problem with that is that it's confusing sort of like different forms of domination. The kind of domination that happens in bourgeois liberalism is less obvious, but it's still there. It's called exploitation, and that's sort of like one of the main arguments here. But more interesting than that, also like he develops here some of the arguments that you can also find in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, I think it's the second chapter, I'm not sure, of like the culture industry. I've heard that there's some critiques to Theodor Adorno for saying that basically he's an elitist, because he's saying that intellectuals are having to dumb down their research, whatever they write, their works, in order to make them accessible for society. The problem, he's not saying that. What he's saying is that everything is becoming a product, that every single statement is reduced to a slogan. That is what he's diagnosing. It's not the fact that it's not like he's not denying that philosophy can or should have or not clarity. He's not discussing about that. He's discussing about how it has to be marketed, right? So obviously, when you encounter a philosophical text that is difficult, you will always, or a piece of art that is complex, you will always have to dive through it a few times. You will always have to involve certain will and discipline to be able to really delve through the different sort of like concepts that it opens up for you, and maybe then after a certain struggle, get some understanding out of it. Wanting to make something that is inherently complex overly simple, it's one of the tendencies that capitalism has with everything. It reduces complex movements, complex ideas, complex dynamics to the most absolutely simple in order to make them marketable. That's for example with I can think of the hippie movement, for example. Like the hippie movement started being something that was sort of like a form of dissidence against a government that was sending bombs, like that was basically, you know, like the typical colonial imperialism that the US does, and against the violence of the government and the oppression, both economical and actually physical, the actual violence exerted by the government. People sort of started going out and like living by these values of peace and love, at least performing their performing actions that exalted the importance of those values. But the hippie movement was quickly assimilated by capitalism. This is not on the book, this is just an example I'm trying to give. But the hippie movement was, this is all improvised by the way, I'm not using scripts or anything, I'm literally just vomiting here what I read throughout the day. But yeah, so I'm completely blank now. Yeah, so by oversimplifying that, by taking this movement that had a very specific political connotation, a very specific moral value attached to it, and reducing it to what? Right now, if you wanna be a hippie, you just have to buy the right amount, the right clothes in the right brand name, and then you are sort of like attaching to yourself that label, right? So that with many different movements, you can see that happening. That a complex idea becomes another Big Mac, a burger that you can buy. Even those actions that are sort of trying to fight against the system, you will see them being. This is something that I think Zizek comments at some point, that even solidarity has become passive. Adorno says that solidarity is literally is only possible in absolute solitude and torment, because the only way to be solidarity is to first of all see what's the problem with society, and second of all isolate yourself from it in order to be able to help anyone at all. Because the alternative, if you live within a society where everything has a number attached to it, then what's happening is that everything is a means to an end. So this is why I also took out some of the books I've been reading like the last month. McIntyre also talks about that, and I think the first person that says something about this is Kant. I think, I'm not sure, because I might be mixing up with the What is Enlightenment text, but I think in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says at some point that people should be treated as ends, not as means. But the problem, like, if everything has a number, a value attached to it, and you live in a society that is that its main, like the main fuel of its machinery, its power and capital value, then any relation is gonna be conditioned by that. A book is no longer a book. Its value is no longer the knowledge that you can find in it. Its value, as long as you buy it, and I'm not advocating for stealing books, but its value as long as you live in a society in which you have to purchase it, and everything everywhere is always pointing at the number that it has on the back to attribute it as a certain value. But your relationship to it is always be reduced to that. It's always going to be to a degree reduced to that. Of course, she also says that like there's exceptions, right? But precisely the exception confirms the rule, right? Is if every artistical to say that's another thing, yeah. Adorno titles his works a polemic, right? This is Adorno, Reflections on a Damaged Life. Adorno, like he was a refugee from this, what was going on with the Second World War, the concentration camps. That is the context in which he is writing, and he was forced to live in a society that he despised, which was a capitalist society. I'm not really a fan of biographical information, but in this case I thought it was important. But yeah, so that's the main point. I'm just gonna read some extracts And as we go through this, some other things will come to mind. I remember when I was reading your Orwell Down and Out in London and Paris, and this can also count as a small review for this book as well. The reason why I liked it so much is because like the 10 years that I worked before starting my studies, I worked in many different jobs, in like 20 different jobs, more than that. I've been a chef, a waiter, I've worked in construction, I've been a scuba diving instructor, I've worked in the porn industry. I've literally done like, I've been in every single extract of society. And I could totally see how like what Orwell is criticizing here in this society, which is, you know, a few years ago, but it hasn't got much better. Like there is a chapter, which is the one that I believe everyone should read, which is, there you are, chapter number 22. This is the chapter that summarizes like the whole book, in my opinion. Yeah, that's it. This is the chapter that summarizes the whole book, in my opinion. And to sum up, I'm just gonna read the last paragraph. And this is like, you know, George Orwell's experience as down and out in London and Paris, working as a working class person, as a homeless person, as a person of like low classes. This extends all the way up in society, but the consequences are most brutally felt on those parts of the societal structure. He says, to sum up, a plongeur, a KP, is a slave, and a wasted slave, doing a stupid and largely unnecessary work. He is kept at work ultimately because of a vague feeling that he would be dangerous if he had lesser. And educated people who should be on his side acquiesce in the process because they know nothing about him, and consequently they are afraid of him. I say this of the plongeur because it is the case. I have been considering, I can say the same for like 10 different jobs. It would apply equally to numberless other types of workers. These are only my own ideas about the basic facts of a plongeur's life, made without reference to immediate economic questions and no doubt largely platitudes. I present them as a sample of the thoughts that are put in one's head by working in a hotel. Back in this same chapter, like if you read it back through the text, if you have this book at hand at some point, just read each chapter. You don't even have to buy the book. It would take you like a couple of minutes, and you'll see like how he questions first of all things like managerial expertise. He criticizes bureaucracy. Yeah, in this he agrees. Like I saw that for the first time in McIntyre. I keep seeing it over and over and over. I can see how so many writers, intellectuals, and thinkers from like different times came to the same conclusions. But yeah, you go back. Chapter 22, and you'll see a question, like a solid and systematic questioning of authority, which is illustrated throughout the book with experience that if you've ever worked, it's gonna be very relatable. But not only questioning of those authorities, also an exploration of the absurdity of the social classes, the absurdity of the roles that we are attached, the uselessness of most of them, how most of the jobs that exist are sort of like only there so that someone else who has power over you can still have that power and can maintain their privileges, and how like a vague promise of someday maybe acquiring that luxury that you sort of like look forward to, and so the luxury of dominating others can be maybe achieved, and because of that you keep working like 50 hours a week or whatever you do. But yeah, that's I think that's an okay summary, especially like improvised, and it's been a while since I read this book now. But this is a really nice way to see illustrated, especially like in relation to hierarchies and like the sort of like financial, hierarchical, and more palpable aspect. For a critique of bureaucracy and especially bureaucracy, but like managerial stuff and all of that, I would recommend Kafka's Metamorphosis. I remember, I think there's another one, I think it's The Castle, that also talks a lot about that. I didn't read The Castle, so I recommend the Metamorphosis, which is also a book that, I mean, like, you have to read that book. If you haven't read that book, I don't know what you're doing with your time. You should stop watching this if you're watching this, and go do that. But yeah, that's another thing. Like bureaucracy is like just adding more steps in the ladder. Like and the manager is just like most manager. Like that's another thing he observes in Down and Out, in London and Paris, is that how like first of all. Most people in the lowest side, in the lowest part of the, like for example, if you're in a kitchen, right? Like the KP, all the people who's in the cleaning, those are gonna be immigrants, normally of a specific nationality. Then the next level are a different kind of immigrants that are less racialized, and like all the way going up until like the head chef, who might be half resident, half, but he's still sort of like the person you look forward to be someday, and sort of dominate the rest of the structure that is within that pyramid, because he's still an slave to the degree. You know, like the boss of a small business, he's still overworking, because over him there's like another manager normally, depending, especially when the business become bigger, and another manager, and at the end of the whole scale, you get a person with a lot of money who doesn't do anything but sustains the myth. I think I heard Steve Donaghy saying this, that like Bill Gates doesn't do anything, but he has a team of people that make sure that that's basically making sure that you believe that he's very busy, that, you know, like his life is fucked up, like Elon Musk, you know, I don't sleep at all. You know, obviously they want to maintain that myth. Obviously, because that's what justifies, like, that's how you justify them being there. You think, if I work really hard, I will somehow gain that power. But the problem is, it happens way before that. The problem is that really what capitalism teaches you to want is not really the luxury or the relaxation, it's the power. Power is always power over someone. I mean, this is a very anarchist argument, but it's just true. Like, and that's why capitalism is a society of domination. And it's just not it's not just a society of domination, but it's also like the illusion of a possibility to dominate others is what makes the slaves want to keep going up and remain as slaves. I'll remain as a slave as long as I have a prospect of ever becoming a master. So on that note, I'm just gonna go through this. I'm just gonna read some extracts and see what ideas come to my mind or what notes I wrote on the side. I'm just gonna check if I'm still recording. Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. So Minima, Moralia from Theodor Adorno. Also, this might have become my new favorite book. So just saying that I totally recommend it. It's tough. This is hard to read. This is not like. Yeah, I mean, if you are interested in the topic I'm talking about, but you are beginning to read, I would then recommend reading Down and Out, in London and Paris from George Orwell. Then I would recommend reading Strange Labour from Marx, if you want something more philosophical. But I wouldn't go directly to this unless you have a background reading philosophy, because yeah, this is some of the most dense, packed texts I've read so far. Okay, so yeah, for example, just in section 5 of page 25, he's titled "How nice of you, Doctor." He starts saying, "There is nothing innocuous left." What does he mean by that? There is nothing that is not offensive. There is nothing harmless anymore. Basically, he's going to go to say that even the little pleasures, expressions of life that seemed exempt from the responsibility of thought, not only have an element of defiant silliness or callous refusal to see, but directly serve a diametrical opposite. So we live in a society of poles that are continuously confronted, and that happens because of the simplification that later on he's going to argue capitalism creates. This is the thing. This like the yeah. Lower, he says something that I believe is like the synthesis of his main ideas, which goes on to say like, but I'm just gonna read from there's like on Opus left, the little press expression, Carlos refusal of his opposite. Even the blossoming tree lies the moment its bloom is seen without the shadow is seen without the shadow of terror. Even the innocent, how lovely, becomes an excuse for an existence outrageously unlovely, and there is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze. And here, this is what I mean. There is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze, falling on horror, withstanding it, and in an alleviated consciousness of negativity, holding fast to the possibility of what is better. What he's saying here is basically what I believe is the philosophical proposition of Adorno overall. There is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze. So this is obviously where we should go in his aesthetic theory. I assume there is no longer beauty or consolation except in the gaze, falling on horror, withstanding it, and in an alleviated consciousness of negativity, holding fast to the possibility of what is better. I found I found the specific, like I saw the specific relevance of this after doing the reading. Going through YouTube, there is a critique, not critique, like an analysis from philosopher Fernando Castro from Spain. If you speak Spanish, I would I mean, like, if you speak Spanish, go there and watch his video because he's an expert on this. I'm just a student. But yeah, that's I saw after watching his video, I saw the relevance of this sentence. Moreover, he, like, at the end of that section 5, he was like, for intellectual, inviolable isolation is now the only way of showing some measure of solidarity. Precisely, because further, like in later sections, he will argue how, like, basically, because the system is a system of domination, he says, like, within wrongness, right cannot be done, or like one cannot live rightly in wrongness. So, like, you have to isolate yourself in order to be truly solidary, because as long as you live in a society that, like, forces you to see people as means, to attach a number to them, to see their worth related to their income or to how much can you take from them, you will never be able to be truly solidary. It will always be what I think it's Ayn Rand called egoistic altruism. All collaboration, all the human worth of social mixing and participation merely masks a tacit acceptance of inhumanity. Yeah, I mean, he speaks for himself. I think it's just, you know, each statement is full of meaning, and anyone with the capacity to really read into it will see what he means. Only from the absolute disappointment and melancholy of acknowledging this reality is that one can really have solidarity towards others. That would be sort of like the summary of that. The next section is called antithesis, and basically he in that section he's basically arguing that, like, we need to acknowledge the decadency of culture to begin with. That's like a priori requirement. I really like just the way he starts. He says, he who stands aloof runs the risk of believing himself better than others and misusing his critique of society as an ideology for his private interest. I believe this is what happened, for example, in Spain with the political party Podemos, you know. they stood up as saviors of society and were completely basically completely parasited a movement that was legitimate in the beginning, which is the 15th of March. No, 15th of March. Of May. In section 7, they, the people, this is also really interesting. There is a extract here where he says, repudiation of the present cultural morass presupposes sufficient involvement in it to feel it itching in one's fingertips, so to speak, but at the same time the strength drawn from this involvement to dismiss it. I'm gonna read it one more time. Repudiation of the present cultural morass presupposes sufficient involvement in it to feel it itching in one's fingertips, so to speak, but at the same time the strength drawn from its involvement to dismiss it. So yeah, it's basically unescapable. Like following Lore in this extract, basically he observes how, for whoever has watched The Dark Knight, he's basically saying that if you live long enough, you'll see yourself become a villain, even if you started claiming something else. And this is like the typical claim of power corrupts people, but a society that has power as its basic value, because the capital is money, but money is also translated into power, so they are completely linked. If there is like a number attached to everything, that number is the amount of power that thing costs or will give you, and therefore everyone is corrupted at some point. This is a very depressing text, but I believe incredibly valuable. In section 9, for example, he says immorality of lying does not consist in the offense of a sacrosanct truth. Here he's appealing to in the generality of morals, one of the main statements that Nietzsche makes is that God is dead, right? So God is dead, therefore what he means by this is obviously the values are dead, there is no morality. He traces all morality back to guilt, but he through the genealogy he pretty much argues and demonstrates that there is no longer an objective compass to measure that morality, right? There is no God that we can look up to and believe in to trust our own actions and to speak of things as good and evil, right? Descartes and Spinoza, for example, they build their whole philosophies with. Spinoza not so much. Forget about Spinoza. For me, Spinoza was an atheist. Spinoza forever. But Descartes, you start reading Descartes' Meditations, and he's like, yes. But at some point, he has to bring back God in order to be able to believe in reality and to believe in everything else. So what Descartes is really doing is relying on God even for the construction of reality. That's a bit different, but what I'm trying to say is that similarly in morality, the idea of good and evil was always deontologist, in the sense that it was good and evil because there was a sort of moral superiority that was there was the idea of God, of any sort of entity that created these two sides. And then in the moment of the death of God, which came for many different reasons, but basically at some point society after the Enlightenment, by criticizing everything and by sort of bringing up reason, and that's also part of what they talk about in the dialectic of the Enlightenment afterwards, of how that was the beginning of the end in many ways, and that's why he was so anti-Enlightenment. But the point is that the Enlightenment process killed God. You have Darwin, you have like there's many different ways in which God was killed, but by removing him from the picture of morality, you are left with a chaos and disorder of morals, but they are not gone. Like, you killed God, right? That means that you killed the authority of higher values. So, but values are not disappear. They did not disappear. They just are devalued, right? So, what means that values are devalued? It means that truth and lying, for example, no longer have a difference of value. Like, if you watch the TV, if you look at the president of whichever country you are from, you will see that half of the things you see in pretty much any form of media, in any social conversation, are lies. And the thing that offends people is not that others lie, it's when they do it badly. So all you expect is someone to lie to you properly in a way that can seem to be believable. But the biggest lie of all, the one that's sort of like the lie of good and evil, it's no longer believed. So you are left with a society that has that's constructed on those values. You don't do this because it's evil. You don't do that because you do that because it's good. But there is not a explicit or there is just nothing to sustain it. So the only reason why it doesn't completely collapse is because we don't acknowledge it out loud. This is what Zizek in psychoanalysis more generally calls the big other, in the sense that, like, in Zizek would say, in a Stalinist society, you could not say that you were not allowed to say something, right? It's better that you say something you're not allowed to say than to say that you could not say that you're allowed to do it, because the fact that it was prohibited was something that no one really stated out loud, right? So it's a big other in the sense of like a third entity that those things that everyone knows doesn't want to know, and it's always it's like ever present, and that's sort of like it's almost like an extension of a superego, right? So if you are in a conversation with another person and they say something and you say something that everyone knows, like, it's not, I mean, like, I don't know, imagine that I don't know, any polemic statement that goes sort of like, that doesn't really fit into the most basic mediocre moral framework that is built around social discourse, you will be looked at like, what the fuck have you just said? When the truth is that everyone knows that thing is just true. The difference is that what you are not acknowledging is that everyone also knows that you're not supposed to say it anyways. Why are you not supposed to say it? Because the secret, the lie remains a secret as long as it's not said out loud. But the problem with bourgeois morality is that because it's built upon freedom, that is built upon an idea of freedom that just does not exist anymore, right? There is no freedom or equality anymore. You can see, like, half of that's another section, like where he talks about, like, how homelessness and people, how basically, like, there's people who basically doesn't have anything even within first world countries, and there is people who has to go to, like, I mean, you can go to jail in the US for, like, sitting on a policeman's car, or like sitting on the door of a policeman's car, or smoking a joint on the park. Just very, very basic things are enough to make the already implicit lack of freedom that you have explicit by putting you in jail. But there is already an authority in that sense. There was never a true sense of freedom, in the sense that you could actually not do whatever you want. It's not about doing whatever you want, but be in whichever way you want to be. So yeah. So yeah, like, basically that evaluation of the higher values remain for the Manichaeism of bourgeois narratives, as consensual lies hidden to that big goal that I was talking about, but available to everyone else, and that's the point. Like, if you're working in a hotel and your manager doesn't do anything, you have to pretend, like if your manager comes to you pretending that he's very tired because he's been working a lot, you have to pretend that that's the case, because that is one of those sort of like, that's just an example of a lie that like everyone knows that this person is not doing anything. Everyone knows that the politicians in Spain rob. Everyone knows that politicians in general are lying to us, but you don't want to say that. Especially they don't want to say that, because then the bigger that we realize, and what would be the result of that? Chaos, or maybe change? I don't know. Okay, yeah. I really like it as well, the section 13. I'm not gonna go much longer because I could be talking here for the whole night and I haven't had dinner yet. But in section 13 it's called protection, help and counsel. It's a lot about like the alienation of outsiderness, the life of like an immigrant or life in exile, because at some point, you know, what is the difference between immigrating and exile when you are immigrating because you are forced to immigrate, right? I mean, like, to be honest, I'm not in England because I want to study in England. I am in England because my financial background would only allow me to study here, because here I can sustain myself with working and acquiring money in different ways that in other countries where I would actually like to live is not really available. For example, in Spain, which is much better than England in many ways, but not in terms of the support that it gives to students. So am I really emigrating here, or am I being exiled financially? Every intellectual in emigration is without exception mutilated, and thus well to acknowledge it to himself if he wishes to avoid being cruelly apprised of it behind the tightly closed doors of his self-esteem. I think it's very important also, like, it's mutilated in many ways. Language is one of them, only one of them. Yeah. Between the production of his own existence under the monopoly of mass culture and impartial responsible work, Jones are in an irreconcilable breach. His language has been expropriated, and the historical dimension that nourished his knowledge sapped. I don't know how you pronounce that. Relations between outcasts are even more poisoned than those between long-standing residents. Yeah, that's just a really good section as well. I just personally found that one very compelling. In the 14 you have the bourgeois revenant, basically just talking about how like the bourgeois middle class survive as ghosts that announce calamities. Doesn't matter. Absurdly, the fascist regimes of the first half of the 20th century have stabilized an obsolete economic form, multiplying the terror needed to maintain it, now that its senselessness is blatant. So yeah, that's the way they sort of like maintain their position. In section 16, Adorno reminds us how Goethe spoke of the impossibility of any human relationship that threatened to the incipient solitude that is industrialized, and tried in his novels tried to. In his novels written in the years of traveling, tried to present tact as a form of salvation. Tact is you could translate tact as politeness. Tact is like, I don't know, for example, you're sick, I'll not say, oh, you're sick, you know, I'll sort of like use euphemisms and try to get around rather than just directly ask, how are you doing? if it's something that is somehow emotionally a sensible subject for you, for example. But tact had its time when the bourgeoisie was freed from absolutism, but free and solitary he was responsible for himself. That's not the case anymore. For tact, we know now, has its precise historical hour. This is what he was saying basically. It was the hour when the bourgeoisie individual rid himself of the absolutism compulsion. Free and solitary, he answers for himself, while the forms of hierarchical respect and consideration developed by absolutism, divested of their economic basis and their menacing power, are still just sufficiently present to make living together within privileged groups bearable. On what tact means, you have here tact meant not simply subordination to ceremonial convention. It was precisely the latter, all later humanist and unceasingly ironized. Rather, the exercise of tact was as paradoxical as its historical occasion. It demanded a reconciliation actually impossible between the unauthorized claims of convention and the unruly ones of the individual. Tact is the discrimination of difference. It consists in conscious deviations. Yet, when emancipated, it confronts the individual as an absolute without anything universal from which to be different. It fails to engage the individual and finally wrongs him. Tact is the already broken convention that is yet still actual somehow. It's a convention that just like has expired. We behave as if it didn't, but it actually has, and therefore all the value that it used to have, it's gone. Okay, I'm just gonna talk about section 18, and I'm gonna finish with this section, and I'm gonna talk about section 18, and that's gonna be all for today. So section 17, right now. I just wanted to talk real quick in there when he says, this is the mournful truth that has emerged from Zarathustra's exuberant no doctrine of a freely chosen death. Freedom has contracted to pure negativity, and what in the days of Art Nouveau was known as a beautiful death has shrunk to the wish to curtail the infinite abasement of living and the infinite torment of dying, in a world where there are far worse things to fear than death. What does he mean by that? First of all, there's like a critique of like the Heideggerian idea of I will die my own death, which you can see in Being in Time. So there is no longer death as like in the sense that Rilke would say also like I will die my own death. As like an experience that would sort of like unite temporalities and condense some sort of kind of like meaning towards the next generations. These forms of dying in general has sublimated into an ideology that is accomplice of the worst. Here he's basically criticizing Heideggerian philosophy. And that idea of death, the idea of like I will die my own death, because that idea was built in a society in which death was all around, and Heidegger was fully involved ideologically, economically, and in every sense with the Nazi Party, and paid his taxes to the Nazis until the very last days of the right, and his sort of like enhancement, or I'd say like I don't know if enhancement is the word, but like his sort of enhancement of death had like an ideological unification with that state, with fascism basically, and that connotation of death anyways is no longer so. Right now, like people is what he's saying here. Like people is concerned with death, and he wants to sort of like involve death in every aspect of their lives. but there's things way worse than death to fear. The objective end of humanism is only another expression of the same thing. It signifies that the individual, as individual, is presenting the species of man, has lost the autonomy through which he might realize the species. So yeah, it's an absolute individuation and isolation of the individual from the rest of society, an ever-present death, almost in a will to death, not in a will to nothing in a Nietzschean sense, but in a sense of like every dynamic within the capitalist society is destructive. That's sort of like what he's arguing for. And finally, yeah, I think this is the final note. I'm not gonna keep going. On the 18th chapter, he talks. It's called "Refuge for the Homeless," and he starts with a statement saying like the predicament of private life today is shown by its arena, and he says dwelling in the proper sense is now impossible. Now this chapter reminds me a lot about Mark Auge and the idea of the non-places. I don't know if you are familiar with this. I totally recommend it. This was like probably one of the first books I read in anthropology, and I found it very, very like enlightening in many ways. He also has a thesis over modernity here. I read this one in Spanish, but I'm sure there is an edition in English. What to say about this book? The idea of non-places. So I think Adorno will illustrate it much better than I can do it, and then I'll go back to that. The traditional residences we grew up in the traditional residences we grew up in have grown intolerable. Each trait of comfort in them is paid for with a betrayal of knowledge, each vestige of shelter with a musty pact of family interest. The functional modern habitations designed from a tabula rasa. What he means by tabula rasa is like, like a machine that's sort of like creating always the same cubicule in which you are meant to be living in. Like I used to work in construction, as I said a moment ago, and we would build pieces for houses. And it was like basically you build a piece. First of all, you are already completely alienated from the work you are doing because you no longer see what you are creating. So if I'm building a house, and if I were building a house in like a sort of like on the countryside in Spain, maybe I would get to see the house from its foundation all the way to when the house is built, and somehow that gives me a sense of self-realization. I have created something. But the way the industry works and the way it sort of like it's the tendency is towards the second option, which is what happens in like any big construction company. It's like you just make these pieces, then they put them together. You never get to see what you create. You just like make a thing that has a form, and somehow it's you do a very small part of the process. It's another thing, like I was doing the ferrite, which is like the metal structure that goes into the things that then they fill up with concrete, and then you have like a shape, and that shape fits into another shape, and that's all. And at the end, with those pieces, like they will make 100,000 rooms or houses or like offices, whatever, but they are all gonna be exactly the same. There is not gonna be any sort of like creative input apart from those creative aspects that make the house more marketable, more functional, and that's it. So it completely homogenizes the most personal and intimate and personal, especially personal place, which is the one you live in. It should be a projection of your own inner world to a degree. So yeah, the functional modern habitations designed from a tabula rasa are living cases manufactured by experts for Philistines or factory sites that have stayed into the consumption sphere, devoid of all relation to the occupant. In them, even the nostalgia for independent existence, defunct in any case, is sandpacking. Modern man wishes to sleep close to the ground like an animal. A German magazine decreed with a prophetic masochism before Hitler, abolishing with the bed the threshold between waking and dreaming. The sleepless are on a call at any hour, unrestingly ready for anything, alert and unconscious at once. Anyone seeking refuge in a genuine but purchased period-style house embalms himself alive. So yeah, that's it. Like even now when they sell you like these mini flats, which is it's very cute. I like living in small places, but the idea of a mini flat, it's at some point, if we were to take this logic to the end, what's gonna be next? It's basically a coffin already. So the idea is take as the minimum amount of space as possible to enhance your productivity, to make everything as of like as efficient as it can be conceivably possible, and then please die. We take your coffin and just put it back in the dead people cage. I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but that's sort of like an exaggeration that illustrates a tendency that is very clear. Like, I mean, if you look back in time, even now in my university, like in front of my university, I can see the older building, which if I were seeing that building, and this is what Mark Auge, at the end I'm talking about Mark Auge, if you're seeing that building in, like, imagine I've never been in England, but I saw that building, the old building that they made in the university, I would be able to tell that's England, because it has imprinted the culture in the architecture, in the materials, in the shape, in everything. While the building I was looking at from was a new library that they built, and this library was like an airport, like a hotel. These are places Mark Auge called non-places, and he believes that we live in a society that is today he calls over-modernity. There is other theses. There is you have liquid modernity, you have meta-modernity, post-modernity. There's many ways to diagnose the society we live in now. This is a really interesting proposal in my opinion, and I think a very valuable text. And the idea with over-modernity is that, I mean, I'll talk about over-modernity later, but the idea is that the places that we engage as beings and socialize are completely removed from their anthropological history. So there is no culture, there is no identity. So when you go into an airport, for example, you cannot really tell if it's the airport of New Delhi or the airport of Moscow or the airport of Chicago, because all airports look the same. Many hotels have the same aspect. What Adorno is sort of speaking of here is a tendency that even our houses are starting to become like that. They are losing that personality. They are like all shapes are made the same. They are manufactured and made in like mass production. That's what he refers to as the culture industry. This is one of its faces, and I don't think it's important to talk about what is over modernity now, because it's longer than that. It's and that's particularly to Mark Auge's thought. It's basically, but over modernity or super modernity, it means like an expansion of time and space and the ego of individual within a society. But that's very complex, and I'll make a video specifically for this when I reread it. But coming back to the text. Adorno says, the house is past. The hardest, before that he says, the attempt to evade responsibility for one's residence by moving into a hotel or furnished rooms makes the enforced conditions of immigration a wisely chosen norm. The hardest hit, as everywhere, are those who have no choice. They live, if not in slums, in bungalows that by tomorrow might be left huts, trailer, cars, camps, or the open air. The house is past. My mother lives in an occupational house and in a caravan before that. In the US, millions of people live like that. And it's gonna be more and more. The more time goes on and capitalism leads to its inevitable conclusion, if there is such a thing as a conclusion and it's not just an never-ending perishing until the end of times, you will see like that's where we're going. That's where we're going, indeed. The bombings of European cities, as well as the labor and concentration camps, may be perceived as executors with what the imminent development of technology had long decided was to be the fate of houses. These are now good only to be thrown away like old food cans. The possibility of residence is annihilated by that of socialist society, which once missed saps the foundation of bourgeois life. No individual can resist this process. A little bit lower down he says, from a distance, the difference between Vienna workshops and the Bauhaus is no longer so considerable. Purely functional curves, having broken free of their purpose, are now becoming just as ornamental as the basic structures of Cubism. So only the most basic and efficient shapes take place now. There's a lot to say about that, but not my place to do that. Finally, it is even part of my good fortune. This is like a quote from Nietzsche that Nietzsche said in The Gay Science. It is even part of my good fortune not to be a house owner. And to that, Adorno adds, it is part of morality not to be at home in one's home. This gives some indication of the difficult relationship in which the individual now stands to his property, as long as he still possesses anything at all. The trick is to keep in view and to express the fact that private property no longer belongs to one, in the sense that consumer goods have become potentially so abundant that no individual has the right to cling to the principle of their limitation, but that one must nevertheless have possessions. If one is not to sink into that dependence, a need which serves the blind perpetuation of property relations. But the thesis of this paradox leads to the destruction of loveless disregard for things which necessarily turn against people too, and the antithesis, no sooner uttered, is an ideology for those wishing with a bad conscience to keep what they have. And that's the problem. And then he ends with like a murderous statement. He finishes the argument saying, wrong life cannot be lived rightly. And with this I conclude my review of Minima Moralia from Adorno. I think this is one of those books that you will get and you will hate because it's very complex. I have the fortune to have really good secondary sources to understand the texts I read, especially because it's twice as hard for me as English is not my first language and I don't have access to books in Spanish right now. But I think this is one of those books that just keep it next to you all the time, and every now and then open a section, they are self-contained, and read, and maybe you will find something that you felt was wrong about you, your life, or anything in society, and you will understand it through this text, and you will be able to dig deeper into your own situation as a being in a world that's completely mercantilized and in which your full experience is conditioned by values that preceded you, and that if you cannot really tell apart from those that you have sort of built for yourself, then they will owe you. Amazing book. I'm not gonna say my favorite book because I would probably say that every week. That's something that happens when you read a lot, like, and you really try to understand what you're reading. Most of the times, you know, people have stuff to say. They have valuable stuff to say. But honestly, I might even do my masters in Adorno. This has been very, very interesting. All right, I'll see you around.